When Hashem says the first of the Aseres HaDibros in the context of I took you out of Mitzrayim, it's because he wants us to know that the idea of leaving Mitzrayim and getting the Torah is in order that we should be completely dedicated to Hashem. We'll see this in Rashi's commentary. When Rashi comments on the pasuk, the first of the Aseres HaDibros, where Hashem says, I am Hashem who took you out of Egypt, Rashi quotes the words, and this is important, which words he chooses, that I'm the one who took you out of Mitzrayim. Rashi explains, it is sufficient or appropriate that because Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim, that he says to us, we should be subjugated to him. After that, Rashi is going to bring two additional explanations, which we're going to examine later on in the Sikha. The question here is, we know that Rashi is only going to comment if there's something that isn't immediately apparent in the simple understanding of the pasuk. So what in this pasuk is not clear that Rashi has to explain? So the Mizrahi and other Mefarshim like the Gur Aryeh, etc., say very simply that what strikes us over here is the question is, why does the Abishah say, acknowledge me as your God because I took you out of Mitzrayim? And therefore he says, who took you out? Why doesn't he use something which is much more profound, surely, to say, I am Hashem who created heaven and earth? So therefore the Mefarshim say that's what Rashi is coming to introduce to us, to explain to us, because the Abishah took us out of Mitzrayim, from being in a state of slavery. Therefore, because the Abishah took us out of slavery, therefore he, so to speak, earned the rights to be our God, to whom we have to now be subjugated. That's the explanation. It's not the easiest explanation to accept. Because if you take the simplest understanding of the pasuk, there actually is no reason to ask this question in the first place. Why it doesn't say, I am Hashem who created heaven and earth? Why not? Because the context over here is that David is saying, I am your God, you the Jewish people. In other words, we're saying the fact that he took us out of Mitzrayim is an explanation for why Hashem is uniquely our God in a different way to everybody else's. So it only follows logically then that whatever the Eibush is going to say next as the motivation why he should be our God must be something which is uniquely for us. Something that distinguishes us from the rest of the world. Now, out of all of the things that could distinguish us from the rest of the world, why does it choose taking us out of Mitzrayim? That's movement b'pashtus, that's self-evident. Because we know very well that it's as a result of the fact that they were redeemed from Mitzrayim, that they were able to get to Har Sinai, that they could receive the Torah. So it's quite logical. So Rashi should not be bothered by the fact that Al Pi Pshat, it's saying that I am Hashem who took you out of Egypt, and therefore that's not surely what he's addressing in his Pirush. Not only that, but what makes this question even greater is it's not the first time we've been shown that there's a correlation between the Exodus and receiving and accepting the Torah. This concept, that the Exodus is what brings us to the point that we are responsible to accept Hashem as our God, or to put it differently, or to say that the purpose why Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim was so that we would accept Hashem as our authority and serve Him. That concept is mentioned at least 3 previous times. Take for Parashat Shmos, at the beginning of Parashat Shmos, Ne'emar, when the Eibush is speaking to Moshe at the burning bush, he says to him, when you take the people out of Mitzrayim, the purpose will be that they come serve me at Har Sinai. Clearly, therefore, Yitzias Mitzrayim is the reason for Matan Torah, or the reason you have to accept the Eibush as your God is because he took you out of Mitzrayim. That is echoed then at the beginning of Parshas Vayera when it says, tell the Yidden, Hashem's telling Moshe Rabbeinu, tell the Yidden, I'm going to take them out from under the suffering of Egypt, and I'm then going to take them for me as my nation, and I will be their God. Same principle. And you should be aware, cognizant of the fact that I'm the Eibishter who took you out of Mitzrayim. Not only that, Yisro, beyond that, but Parashas Seinu Gufa in Parashas Yisro. As part of the psukim that describe the preparation to receive the Torah, there it says, Nemar, you saw what I did to Mitzrayim, and I carried you out on eagle's wings, and I brought you to me. Therefore, you have to listen to my voice, and you have to observe my covenant, and then you'll be this treasured nation and a holy people. So it doesn't really seem to make sense. Why is it now, the fourth time, that we're told that there's a link between Yetzias Mitzrayim and accepting Hashem as our God? That now Rashi is suddenly bothered by the principle, and he has to give an explanation and say that the explanation is that we deserve it because so to speak, the Eibusha deserves our commitment because it took us out of Mitzrayim. Why now? Why did it become an issue now? Before we can answer that, we're going to explore just three specific details about Rashi's language. There are a few things we have to focus on, subtleties in Rashi's language. Number one, the simplest way to understand this is Rashi is saying that you should be subjugated to me as an explanation of the words, I am Hashem your God. Like the Ra'im said, right, we have to be subjugated to Hashem, and Hashem will be our God. Now, according to that explanation, so Anochi Hashem Elokecha is telling us you have to be committed to the Eibishter. And then, because I took you out of Mitzrayim, is an explanation why you have to be committed. In other words, because I took you out of Mitzrayim, that is what gave you now this responsibility to be subjugated to Hashem. As it says elsewhere in the Torah, Shlach will become a ksuvim acherim in other places. Ani Hashem Elokeichem, Hashem, your God. Asher eitzeis eschem eretz Mitzrayim liyos lachem elokim. I took you out of Mitzrayim in order that I should be your God. Ukapirish Rashi, as Rashi says over there, Al menas kein bodisi eschem. It was on that condition that I redeemed you. Now that's what it sounds like Rashi is saying over here as well. On condition that you'll serve me, that's why I took you out of Mitzrayim. If that's the case, then there are three things about how Rashi says it that don't make sense. The first most glaring one is Aleph. How come Rashi did not include those words in the headline of this commentary? Isn't that what he's explaining? I'm Hashem your God means you should be subjugated to me. How come that doesn't appear in the heading? Number two, Beis. This is a theme that Rashi has repeated on more than one occasion, and in almost all of those places where he tells that where he explains that the purpose of the Exodus was in order that we should accept Hashem as our God. Rashi always uses an expression which is, it's on that condition that you would accept me as God, that I took you out of Mitzrayim, or something along those lines. Whereas Rashi over here says something that sounds completely different. He doesn't say, it's on condition that you'd serve me, that I took you out. Rather, it's kedai, it's appropriate, because I took you out, therefore you should dedicate yourself. What do you mean it's appropriate? Surely that was the precondition. And lastly, Gimel, surely Rashi's language should have reflected the language of the pasuk. I am Hashem your God, and therefore he should have said in his explanation, "Kedai, it's appropriate that you should accept me as your God." Or at least to say, as Rashi says elsewhere, that you should accept my dominion. Something along those lines. How come Rashi is using language which is different from the language of the pasuk? Why is Rashi using an expression that doesn't seem to reflect the words of the pasuk and doesn't seem to match the theme of how Rashi explains this anywhere else? And now he's saying that you should be subjugated to me. Why? So lecheira, maybe the easiest way to explain it is because carry on reading, and you'll see that there are words in the pasuk that speak to the theme of being subjugated. Maybe what Rashi is building his commentary on is the last words of the pasuk that say, I took you out of Egypt from the house of slavery. So therefore we could argue, because the Eibusha took us out of an environment where we were slaves, therefore it's appropriate that as a result of him taking us out, we should become Hashem's slaves. He saved us from being the Egyptian slaves. Similar to the pasuk that says they are now my slaves because I took them out of Egypt. Maybe that's the explanation, except that there's a very obvious reason why that cannot be. It's not a good enough answer for two reasons. Number one, If we were to explain that, it still doesn't really help us understand the language that Rashi is using. Then Rashi should have said, it is appropriate because I took you out of slavery that you should become my slaves. Why did Rashi use a different expression that you should be subjugated? There's a subtle message over there. What's the message? But the more glaring problem is as we well know, Rashi will always quote the words from the pasuk that he intends to explain. Here he only said, who took you out of Egypt. And he did not include in the heading, from the house of slavery. He didn't even hint at the fact that those words are relevant by saying etc. Which implies this concept that David is saying it is appropriate because I took you out of Egypt that you should be subjugated to me. Rashi, that is information that Rashi derived not from the fact that later on in the pasuk it's going to say that what he took us out of was a house of slavery, but somehow Rashi is reading that in those words, I took you out of Egypt. Those words tell us that you have to be meshubed, subjugated to Hashem. Especially when you consider that Rashi left it quite generic. It's good enough that I took you out rather than saying it is appropriate because I took you out of slavery. So the emphasis is not on the fact that they were slaves. So what's Rashi telling us? So rather than trying to explain that Rashi is concerned about the fact that it says, I am Hashem who took you out of Egypt, instead of saying, I am Hashem who created the world, etc. Rashi actually has a different question altogether. Rashi's question on these words, who took you out of Egypt, is it's not because Rashi is concerned, how come it is that the Torah says you have to accept Hashem as your God because he took you out of Mitzrayim? His question is almost the exact opposite. His question is, Michael Mashmalon, what is the pasuk teaching me that I don't already know? I already know the principle that because the Eibusha took us out of Mitzrayim, we're supposed to be dedicated to him. From the get-go, the Jewish people knew that the purpose of leaving Egypt is to accept Hashem's authority at Har Sinai. And that information was reiterated to them in the build-up to receiving the Torah at Har Sinai. As we mentioned before, you saw what I did to Egypt, I took you out, and I brought you to me. Therefore you have to listen to my words and accept my covenant, and be my kingdom of Kohanim and my holy nation. So we already know that getting out of Mitzrayim is for the purpose of accepting Hashem as our king, as our God. If that's true, now Rashi has a question. What is the Torah teaching me now in the first of the Aseret HaDibros that I don't already know? Telling me that the purpose of accepting Hashem as our God is a result of leaving Egypt. But I know that information already. Why is the Torah repeating it? That's what's bothering Rashi. Therefore, Rashi comes from a different perspective, where he says that additional information that tells us that I am Hashem, specifically who took you out of Mitzrayim, is loy ta'am ubiur al kach shanoich Hashem lekecha. That's not a reason or an explanation for why we have to accept Hashem as our God. It's another piece of information in addition to the fact that we have to accept Hashem as our God. Inyan chodash, it's something brand new. What's the new information? That it's appropriate because I took you out of Mitzrayim, that you should be subjugated to me, which we're about to discover is a little different from just simply saying you should be our God. As we've already mentioned, to say that Hashem is our God, that means we accept Hashem's absolute authority. That means that I'm accepting Hashem as my ruler, my king. Which means I'm accepting that I'm going to do all of the things that David wants from me. Once the Abishah just told us that we have a responsibility to accept Hashem's authority and be dedicated to what He wants, then the Torah adds something else. It's not good enough just to accept Hashem's authority, which in turn will prompt us to accept Hashem's mitzvahs. We have to be completely subjugated to Hashem. And that's a totally different, far more extreme version of dedication than accepting Hashem's authority, as we shall see. Because Kabbalah's Malchus the fact that a person accepts Hashem's authority does not preclude the possibility of a little bit of me time. If I accept Hashem's authority, what I'm saying is I'm going to do those specific things that the Eibusher tells me to do. Whether they're proactive things that he wants me to do, or those things that he doesn't want me to do and I have to avoid doing. So if that's how it is with accepting the authority of any king, then it means I'm going to listen to the rules. Same thing if I accept Hashem's authority. That means I'm dedicated. Whatever the Eibusher tells me to do, I'm going to do. Whatever he tells me to avoid, I'm going to avoid. But they interpreted the meaning of the word to be subjugated is that means I don't have independence. I don't have the freedom of doing stuff on the side that is not necessarily what the Eibusher wants, as long as it's not breaking any of the rules. Meshubad means everything about me is subjugated to Hashem, including all of the things that I have at all of the time and all of the actions that I take. In other words, that's what Rashi is telling us up here. It is appropriate, it's a condition. The condition of leaving Egypt is to accept Hashem's authority to do mitzvahs and avoid averas. It's appropriate because Hashem took us out that we do more than just simply doing mitzvahs and not doing averas, that every fiber of our being and every day of our lives should be directed to what the Eibusher wants. Rashi will use the expression amanas when he's telling us something that the Torah says the one element is contingent on the other. Like the pasuk that says, I am Hashem who took you out, in order that I should be your God. But in our context, this concept that you should be subjugated to me, that wasn't a condition, taking you out of Mitzrayim so that you'll be subjugated to me. It's not the condition of leaving Egypt, it's the explanation of what it means to leave Egypt. What's appropriate, because the Eibusher freed us from Mitzrayim, is that now everything about us should belong to Hashem. In other words, Kabbalah soul is I'm doing the right things when the right things are expected. Meshubad means I'm always doing the right thing, even when it's not expected, even when the activity I'm engaged in right now is not technically a mitzvah. That also explains why Rashi deliberately left out the words "mibeis avodim" in the headline. Didn't even allude to it with an etc. Because there's a massive difference between being an eved and being meshubad. What's the difference between meshubadim versus avdos? If you call somebody an eved, you haven't completely ruled out the possibility of any personal freedoms. Yes, of course. A slave is a slave without any independence. Is chattel of his owner. Is completely different to a hired laborer who's only doing a job but still retains their own identity. But the reality is, when do you see that the person is a slave? When they're doing what the master expects of them. So if it's mealtime or sleep time, and at that point the servant doesn't necessarily feel beholden to the master at that point in time. I'm allowed to eat, I'm given my time to sleep. In fact, there's even a possibility of a space of time where the master does not need anything from the Eved. And he could rest. Let's say his job is specifically around the fields. Certain times you don't have to work in the fields. Which means the servant does not have a responsibility to find ways to occupy himself, to do things for the Adon when the Adon doesn't need anything from him. So therefore, he could actually have moments of downtime. But the concept of meshubad, that implies I'm subjugated. I'm constantly beholden to the master at all times, even when there's nothing officially on the agenda. Like we use the same expression shibud with regards to assets. So let's say that I borrow money from somebody and I have property that is now potentially standing as a guarantee on that loan, even if it's not specified, that is called meshubot. That means to say, at any given time, it is linked to the creditor who could come and take it. So if I say somebody's meshubot, that means in everything that they're doing, even in their own time, they feel this responsibility to the adon. Which means even at times when he doesn't officially have a task list, the Eved feels, but I'm still subjugated to the master. And very likely he's going to look for opportunities to show initiative to do things. That's what Rashi specifies over here, that the mitzvah of the first asher of the Aseret HaDibros is that we should be meshubot, subjugated to Hashem, rather than just simply to say you should be my servants, because servants may have time off. In other words, he's telling us what Matan Torah achieved. The fact that at the giving of the Torah we became the Eibishter's slaves or servants, that's something we were already told in Anochi Hashem Elokecha, because that was the condition. You're leaving Mitzrayim in order to be committed to me. Because the Eibishter is our ruler and king. We are under his jurisdiction. As the pasuk says, I'm taking you as my nation, and I'll be your God. And therefore from those words, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, we know that we have to serve Hashem with the dedication of a servant and do whatever is expected. But then the Torah continues and doesn't just say, I'm Hashem your God, but specifically, I took you out of Mitzrayim, and therefore Noisef Oid Inyan, it adds another fundamentally deeper dimension to this relationship. From here we learn that it is appropriate, because the Eibishter took us out of Mitzrayim, therefore we should be completely beholden to him. Yes, the official condition of the Exodus was that we should be Hashem's nation and dedicated to him. And our relationship with Hashem, dedication to Hashem, could be very similar to the dedication of ordinary people to their king. Despite the fact that those are the black and white rules, the fact that the Eibishter took us out makes it appropriate that we should be even greater, more dedicated to the Eibishter. It's logical. The Jews were slaves in Egypt. And they weren't just slaves. They were slaves who were oppressed and they were abused. They had backbreaking work. And even at a time when the work was already overbearing, Paro made the work even worse, which means it was beyond all normal structures and all normal expectations. And the Eibishter took us out of that. Therefore, the fact that the Eibishter managed to take us out of such an overbearing situation, it is appropriate that we, in response, should not just be ordinary servants dedicated to doing what Hashem wants, but we should be meshubot, to be constantly beholden to the Eibishter at all times and feel the Eibishter's authority over us at all times. That is Rashi's message. Now, with such a clear message and such a clear explanation of the psukim, you do have to wonder why Rashi then included two other alternate explanations. So now that we have this information, that the fact that the Torah says, I'm Hashem your God, who took you out of Egypt, that took you out of Egypt is not an explanation why we should accept Hashem's authority, but it's a whole different layer of dedication, something brand new. So with that information, now we can understand why after Rashi is given this explanation, he brings two additional explanations, and here are those two explanations. And as we're about to discover, both of these explanations don't really seem to fit so nicely with the Pshat, which makes you wonder, Rashi had a really compelling explanation, why is he going any further? Says Rashi, an alternate explanation. The Eibishter appeared at the sea like a powerful warrior. And yet here they perceive the Eibishter as a compassionate old man, so to speak. As the pasuk tells us. The Eibishter says, because I have different appearances, don't think that there is more than one deity. Therefore he says, I, Hashem, who you're perceiving right now at Har Sinai, and the same as the Eibishter that you perceived at the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, or specifically at the time of Kriyas Yamsuf. Davar acher, another explanation. Because they heard multiple voices coming from all four directions and above them and below them. Don't believe that maybe there are multiple deities. And then Rashi after that explains. So Anochi Hashem Elokecha is verifying that in spite of the different apparitions, all the different sounds, it's actually only one God. After that, Rashi then says something else. Why did David address them in the singular? I am your singular God. It was to give Moshe an opening to defend the Jewish people after they made Egel Azov. What's the defense he was going to use? You weren't speaking in the plural, therefore they did not recognize that this prohibition against idols was directed at them. They thought you were talking just to me. This is so strange. Rashi is focused on giving us the simplest explanation of the psukim. So what's missing in his first explanation, where the message is actually a very clear and powerful message, and is corroborated by other psukim that really say the same kind of concept, that Yetzias Mitzrayim is in order that we should dedicate ourselves to Hashem. So what's lacking in that explanation? Why does Rashi then have to introduce two other commentaries, which actually seem very far from the simple understanding of the pasuk? And why they're so far from the simple understanding of the pasuk? First of all, generically, the theme that they're speaking about, the very suggestion that we have to clarify for the Jewish people that there's not more than one God speaking to them or appearing to them. How can you suggest that at this point in their history, after all the miracles that they witnessed in Yetzias Mitzrayim and at the sea, while they're standing at Har Sinai, now we have to address the possibility that they're going to think that there's more than one deity? How's that even shayach in pshat? And the time must be because even if they saw different apparitions of Hashem, that's not a good enough reason why they'd have questions. Because it's self-evident. We see in human conduct as well. That people also look different from time to time, depending on what they're doing. Sometimes you look compassionate, sometimes you look angry. A person's expression and facial their face is going to look different when they're going to war to when they're dealing with something compassionate. And for sure, they have to address the possibility that they're going to mistake the fact that there's more than one God because they're hearing multiple voices. Why is that a problem? All the voices are saying the same message. Why would you think that there's a problem? Not just any message. The message is, I am Hashem, there are no other gods. Why would you perhaps get it wrong? So that's first of all. So generally speaking, the concept of why you have to address the possibility that people are going to misunderstand God at this critical moment sounds far-fetched. Besides that, in each of these explanations, there's a problem. But Pirush Harishan and move on the first explanation, it doesn't seem to make sense because Hakadosh Baruch Hu nigla kan kazakim v'lerachamim lefir Pirush Rashi kvar b'chamishi b'sivan. If we're worried that now the Eibishter is appearing as a kind old man, that happened already a few days ago, right? Or at least the day before Chamishi b'sivan. That's the 5th of Sivan. Certainly before the Eibishter actually said the Aseres HaDibros. So if there's the possibility that people are going to flounder on a core principle of belief, then the Eibishter should address it immediately as soon as it becomes an issue. And not wait until he's now launching the Aseres HaDibros, and then in the middle of the Aseres HaDibros use language which is to address an issue that has actually been an issue for possibly at least a day. And the second explanation, that we're concerned that they'll be bamboozled by all the voices. So you're saying that the Jews could be misled because they're hearing the Aseres HaDibros in multiple voices? That's difficult. As Rashi himself asks. Why does it say Elekecha in the singular? Without this explanation, it wouldn't have been a problem. Because it's not uncommon for the Eibishter to address the Jewish people in the singular. Especially in Matan Torah, where there's such a degree of unity, the whole people are there like a single person with a single heart. But the minute Rashi tells us that there's a possibility, there are many voices, and therefore you could think there are many people conversing, then it should have specifically spoken in the plural. If you're speaking in the singular, you potentially create a possibility that I think one God is talking to me and another God is talking to you. So it should have dafka been in Lashon Rabbi. So what Rashi is trying to help us understand is actually apparently making it more difficult. Rashi's explanation that Moshe needed a way to be able to defend the Jewish people after the golden calf is very far from the simplest understanding. What kind of an excuse is that? What do you honestly think that Moshe Rabbeinu could defend the Yidden by saying the Eibishter wasn't talking to them? But because so that only ramps up our question. What prompts Rashi over here to bring two additional, what appear to be very weak explanations? But based on what we've already learned, it actually falls into place. Because the first explanation Rashi gave, which was that there are two principles being taught. Is principle number one, that because I took you out of Mitzrayim, the precondition was that you would accept my authority, so now you have to do so. Accept me as my God, and therefore accept my instructions. In addition to that, Mitzrayim means because I took you out of Egypt, it's appropriate that you should be subjugated to me even more than just simply following instructions. If those are two separate concepts, then the language doesn't work so easily in the pasuk, because it says Anochi Hashem Elokecha Asher Hoitzi Sicha Meretz Mitzrayim. Asher, that lashon Asher Moira b'derech klal hemshech lenemer lifnei usually means that what I've just read is a continuation of what I read before. It's normally not a word that you use to say, and now I'm giving you brand new information, yet Rashi is saying it is brand new information. So although the explanation is compelling, the wording doesn't fit so perfectly. Whenever an explanation is not 100% perfect, Rashi will bring an alternate explanation, even if the alternate explanation is a lot weaker, because at least it will give us a way to address that particular question. That's how Rashi brings the other psukim. That those psukim do work well with the flow of the pasuk, as Rashi emphasizes, according to the second explanation, and likewise the third, I'm the same God who took you out, I'm the same God who's speaking, even though you're hearing it from different places. Now, Rashi is there. Just seeing as we raised it, the last part that Rashi speaks about, that the Eibishter was willing to speak in the singular so that Moshe would have a bit of wiggle room to defend the Jewish people after the golden calf, that's going to teach us an incredible lesson. About how much the Eibishter absolutely cherishes every single one of us. Because who are we talking about over here? The objective of Matan Torah is to be completely subjugated to the Eibishter. And here we're talking about what kind of Jew the person is not subjugated. And in fact, not only are they not subjugated, we could say they're at the opposite extreme of accepting Hashem's absolute authority because they're making a golden calf. So to address the wayward behavior of that Jew, the Eibishter is now speaking to all Jews for all times in the singular. That Moshe Rabbeinu should have some kind of an excuse that he could use to try and defend these rogue Jews. Not only that, we also said that by the fact that the Eibishter is using the singular, it creates more of the opportunity of being misled into thinking this deity is speaking to me and that deity is speaking to you. And I'm doing that for what purpose? To create what appears to be a very weak defense of the Jewish people. As the Mefarshim say, what's the point of this defense? Yet the Eibishter says it is worth taking the risk of people misinterpreting Hashem's oneness. because it's worth taking that risk to be able to possibly defend a Jewish person, even such a wayward Jewish person. And maybe some people will misunderstand it, as the Gemara tells us, that Abisha says on more than one occasion, write it as I say it, and if people want to mislead themselves, that's their choice. That leaves us with a tremendous lesson. We have to reach out to draw every single yid close to Torah. It's not up to us to start deciding this Jew is worth investing in and that Jew not so much. The Torah rejects that suggestion out of hand by telling us that right in the very first of the 10 Commandments, the Eibishter created an opportunity. He created a way to be able to find a defense for the Jew who in the future is going to reject everything and make an Egel Azov. Even though that's a complete rejection of this exact message, which is I am Hashem your God. That's how the Eibishter treats every yid, and therefore we have to treat every yid. How much more so nowadays? The vast majority of Yidden who need a little bit of encouragement to re-engage with their Judaism are people who can't be blamed for that. They're like a child who was lost and assimilated in the non-Jewish world and doesn't know any different. We have to find a way to them. By the Dekir of Kol Bnei Yisrael Avinu Shabashamayim Bas, drawing every yid close to the Eibishter, that builds this massive community that is predicted to go to greet Mashiach, and that should happen literally now.